This is the Sky Sports Top 10 Heavyweight World Rankings, as you can see on screen. I did watch a clip where this World Rankings was taken from on Sky Sports. There was Spencer Oliver and I think it was Darren Barker as well. And they were discussing this top 10. And I think Spencer Oliver was saying that this is the best top 10 at heavyweight that he's seen for many, many years. And I can only agree. The heavyweight division is far, far, far deeper in terms of talent now than it was during the majority of the Klitschko reign. Far deeper. You got Tyson Fury number 1, Klitschko 2, Deontay Wilder 3, Joshua 4, Povetkin 5, Joseph Parker 6, Kubrat Pulev 7, Luis Ortiz 8, David Haye 9, Andy Ruiz 10. That is a very, very strong top 10. The issue at the moment, and the thing that's frustrating a lot of people, is the fact that these guys are not fighting each other. A strong top 10 where nobody's fighting. I understand people's frustration. But inevitably, these guys are going to fight. This year was disappointing in terms of heavyweight boxing. Let's not get it confused. So much was promised, but so little was delivered. But you cannot have a top 10 like that and have all of those guys avoid each other. It's impossible. They're going to have to fight at some stage. It's just a waiting game. And it's the same as it was. I know people are probably sick of hearing me saying this, but it's the same as it was in the 90s. In the 90s, we had to wait for those big fights. And actually, a lot of the classic fights that happened in the 90s came out of the blue. When Riddick Bowe fought Evander Holyfield, Holyfield was seen as a paper champion. A lot of people might find that hard to believe at this stage, but I'm telling you, at the time, Holyfield was viewed as a paper champion, as a phony. And a lot of that was due to the fact that he was the champion after Mike Tyson. I mean, obviously he beat Buster Douglas, who beat Tyson, but he was constantly being compared to Tyson. And whenever he would go in there and fight somebody, they would say, oh, Tyson would have done it better. Tyson would have knocked the guy out quicker. They just wouldn't leave Holyfield alone, the critics. And his first defense of the world title was against George Foreman, who was, what, 40-something years old. So they criticized him for that. Oh, he beat up an old man. So what? His second defense of the title was supposed to be against Tyson, but Tyson obviously had his situation with the rape conviction and all that. So he ended up, then he was supposed to fight Damiani. That fight didn't happen either, and he ended up fighting Burt Cooper, a late replacement and a journeyman, who was actually at one time mandatory for Holyfield's cruiserweight title. Burt Cooper was also fighting as a cruiserweight earlier on in his career. But anyway, Cooper at the time was a journeyman, and he wasn't expected to do much against Holyfield. Holyfield, I think, dropped him in the first round with a left hook to the body, and it was all looking very routine. But then suddenly, Cooper caught Holyfield, hurt him badly, and it turned into a war. Holyfield, again, lost credibility because of how much he struggled with a journeyman like Burt Cooper. Then he fought Larry Holmes, another guy who was way up there in age and way past his best. And he did beat Larry Holmes, but a lot of people felt like he struggled. And again, they said, look, Tyson knocked this guy out in 4 rounds. Why is it taking Holyfield so long? So he was seen as a paper champion. He eventually fought Riddick Bowe, and Bowe was seen as his first legitimate test as champion. I mean, even when he beat Buster Douglas, they said, well, that wasn't the Buster Douglas that Mike Tyson fought. That was a fat Buster Douglas, way overweight, unmotivated, fat and happy because he's won all this fame and money after beating Tyson. So he got no credit for that either. So finally, he fought Riddick Bowe. And Bowe, even though he was seen as an interesting prospect in the United States, he had a lot of naysayers as well. There was a lot of people who are very critical of Riddick Bowe, particularly because of the way he lost to Lennox Lewis in the Olympic finals in Seoul in 1988. A lot of the American press were very skeptical of Riddick Bowe on the way up, but they did think that he would be the first decent challenger for Holyfield's heavyweight title. And some people were saying it's probably going to be a good fight, but nobody anticipated that it would turn out to be one of the classic heavyweight battles of all time. And that's what it turned out to be. Their first fight was a tremendous fight. And that kind of came out of the blue. people didn't expect that level of a battle. Two guys, one of them being a champion who was, I guess he was respected, but he wasn't very highly regarded. You know, he wasn't looked at the way Tyson was looked at, as a real force in the heavyweight division, a champion who stamped his authority. That's not what Holyfield was, you know, how he was looked at, how he was perceived. No, he was always looked at as kind of a phony champion and a nice guy and a brave guy, but a guy who was living on borrowed time and living on the fact that Mike Tyson has gone to prison and therefore he's champion almost by default. And Riddick Bowe was seen as a guy who was lazy. There was stories of him getting beaten up in the gym by various different fighters. A lot of the American boxing writers, and remember at the time there was no internet. So the publications, boxing publications, were literally virtually the only source of information that most people had in terms of boxing. So people took the publications very seriously. Ring Magazine, KO Magazine, Boxing Illustrated, so on and so forth. Boxing Monthly in the UK, Boxing News. So yeah, Bowe was, there was a lot of skepticism around Riddick Bowe, even though he was seen as promising. There was definitely a lot of skepticism. So the fact that those two guys managed to produce that type of performance and that type of incredible fight did kind of catch people by surprise. And I'm wondering, people are going to scoff at this, I'm wondering if Joseph Parker versus Andy Ruiz might turn out to be, I don't want to say it's going to be an all-time great battle, but maybe one of the fights of the year, at least in the heavyweight division. Because when I look at those styles, I think, wow, man, them styles are going to, both of those guys have got fast hands. They're both aggressive. They both like to let their hands go. Neither one of them is particularly defensively great, especially Andy Ruiz. That has the potential there to be a great fight. And out of the top 10, it's pretty incredible to think that other than Tyson Fury fighting Klitschko, and Klitschko's obviously also fought Kubrat Pulev, David Hayes fought Klitschko, etc. But when you take Vladimir Klitschko out of the equation, nobody's fought anybody else in that top 10. You know, and it's going to be Joseph Parker and Andy Ruiz as the first guys in that top 10, other than, you know, if you take Vladimir Klitschko out of the equation, Parker and Ruiz will be the first guys to fight each other. Yeah. So they're setting a good example. That's what we need. We need them to fight each other. Then we need the likes of Joshua to fight Wilder, Pulev, Ortiz, Hay versus whoever, Povetkin. You match that top 10 up in any combination, and you're going to get an interesting matchup, potentially an explosive, very exciting matchup. Imagine if they had a tournament of that top 10. That tournament would be one of the best tournaments you've seen in boxing for years if they match that top 10 up. So the potential is there for the heavyweight division to produce fireworks. But at the moment, because of politics and whatnot, it's taken a little while. And again, just to go back to what was going on in the 90s, it took a while for, as I say, a lot of these historical fights to come off. I mean, even Holyfield Tyson, the first fight, that wasn't expected to be a classic. That wasn't expected to be a memorable fight. Most people thought that Tyson was just going to walk straight through Holyfield. Holyfield was seen as washed up, past it, so on and so forth. And yet it turned out to be one of the great heavyweight battles of the 90s, the first fight. These things can come out of the blue, people. Yeah? Fights where you don't expect the dramatic to happen tend to be the ones where the dramatic usually happens. And sometimes you get a matchup of two guys who, on paper, look like they're going to produce a good fight, but it turns out to be a little bit of a disappointment. That can happen as well. One of the fights from the 90s, which obviously never happened in the professional ring, was Lennox Lewis against Riddick Bowe. Early on in Bowe's career, well, when he first became champion, he avoided Lennox Lewis. He threw his WBC belt into the trash, Canelo Alvarez style, to avoid Lewis, who is his mandatory challenger. Later on in their careers, there was opportunities for them to fight again, but Lewis ended up losing to Oliver McCall. And Bo ended up losing to Andrew Golota. I mean, when Lewis fought Andrew Golota, that was because of the fact that Bo, I think he retired after the second Golota fight. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's a long time ago since that happened now. But I think Bo retired after the second Golota fight, and Golota went on to fight Lennox Lewis and got blasted out in a round. That could have been Riddick Bowe had he decided to go on or whatever. But it wasn't to be. And again, there were other fights in the 90s. In fact, I'm not sure if this fight was in the 90s. Was it the 90s? I think it was, the late 90s. Ike Ibeabuchi against David Tua. Again, one of the great heavyweight fights of the era. Came out of nowhere, really. Ike Ibeabuchi came out of nowhere. Nobody knew who the hell this guy was. David Tua was being built up by HBO as the new Joe Frazier / Rocky Marciano / Mike Tyson. And Ibeabuchi was brought in as an opponent, as a guy to give Tua rounds and test him, but not beat him. And he came in there and fought a terrific fight, went toe-to-toe with Tua, outboxed him at points, took a decision in a big upset, and made a name for himself. That fight came out of left field. People didn't expect that type of war. So, as long as the ingredients are there for explosiveness, then that's what people need to focus on. Have a bit of patience, and I'm telling you, these great fights will happen. They will. So, hopefully 2017 brings us some of these fights. I mean, we might see something spectacular if Anthony Joshua fights Vladimir Klitschko. One way or the other, we might see Klitschko get spectacularly dismantled, or we might see Anthony Joshua spectacularly dismantled by Klitschko. We'll have to wait and find out. But that's all I'll say, people. Don't get too despondent and miserable and all this, that, and the other just because the big heavyweight fights didn't happen this year. There's plenty of time yet. Rome wasn't built in a day. All the best heavyweight eras, and particularly the 90s, because that's an era I remember very vividly. The great fights didn't just happen all in one go. There was a lot of waiting around. I mean, Holyfield versus Tyson took years and years in the making before that fight took place. Many, many years. I mean, during the whole Tyson era, Tyson was walking through people. He was mostly fighting, no disrespect, he was mostly fighting Larry Holmes' leftovers. Most of the guys Tyson fought in his original title reign were people who'd lost to Larry Holmes when Holmes was in his prime. So there wasn't really any great fights during the first reign of Mike Tyson at heavyweight. Not many. The first really dramatic fight was Tyson losing to Buster Douglas. Then after that, he had the fights with Razor Ruddock, which were good fights. But, you know, prior to that, there wasn't that many great fights in the Tyson era. It was just Tyson going in and beating up on people who most of the time were not at the peak of their powers. He did beat a couple of prime guys, but they weren't particularly good anyway. So, and then the 90s came along, and a lot of fights took a long time to come to fruition. As I already mentioned, Lewis versus Bowe never came to fruition. That fight never happened. Holyfield versus Tyson took a very long time. Holyfield was supposed to fight Tyson originally after Tyson beat Buster Douglas. Obviously, he didn't beat Buster Douglas, but he was supposed to beat Douglas and then fight Holyfield. But Douglas upset the apple cart, so the fight didn't happen then. Then Holyfield was supposed to defend his title against Mike Tyson, but he got caught with a rape charge, and it didn't happen then. And eventually, many, many years later, when Holyfield was seen as washed up over the hill, 34 years old, clapped out, then the fight happened, and it turned out to be a great fight. You know, Lennox Lewis against Holyfield, that was a fight that was talked about for years, but they couldn't get it together. Holyfield was with the Duvers. Lennox Lewis was with, Lewis was with the Duvers as well. Holyfield was with the Duvers earlier on in his career. Who was he with after that? I know he was with Don King after the Tyson fight. I remember that. I can't remember who he was with promotionally. Maybe he was with the Duvers as well. I can't remember now. But yeah, he was with Don King for a few fights because King had options on him after he beat Tyson. Yeah, King made sure he had options on Holyfield. And it just took a long time for Lewis versus Holyfield to come to fruition. It eventually happened, and the rest is history. And to be honest with you, the Lewis Holyfield fights were not particularly good fights. I mean, the second fight was cool. The first fight wasn't very good. The second fight was, it was all right. You know, there was some interesting moments in the fight, but two guys of that high level, you would hope for a better fight than they produce both times. But, you know, sometimes it doesn't work out like that. I always find, and I keep mentioning this in many of my videos, that the best fights usually occur between two up-and-coming, unproven fighters. That's normally when you get the best fights, in my experience. That's why I was very excited for Anthony Joshua versus Dillian Whyte. And that's why I'm kind of excited for Joseph Parker versus Andy Ruiz. Because when you get these young guys, they have this recklessness about them. They've got this ego about them. These are the type of guys who normally are less likely to go in there and try and box safe. They want to go out there and prove something. They want to hurt somebody and knock somebody out. When you get two of them together, I mean, when you get a veteran versus a young guy, you're not always going to get an exciting fight because the veteran is trying to play it safe a lot of the time and use his brain. But when you get two young guys, sometimes the testosterone levels just go through the roof and all logic and sensible boxing goes out the window and you get a classic, you know. Holyfield, even though when he fought Riddick Bowe, he wasn't exactly a young guy, he was certainly a guy who had a chip on his shoulder when he fought Riddick Bowe. Bowe was a young guy, young, aggressive guy in the shape of his life in his prime. Holyfield was a champion who was upset. I think he was like 30 years old or 31, something like that when he fought Riddick Bowe. He was upset by the fact that the press had given him such a hard time. He was upset by the fact that the press was saying that you don't know Mike Tyson, this, that, and the other. So he had a real big chip on his shoulder when he fought Riddick Bowe. And he went out there and fought far more recklessly than he should have done in that first fight because he wanted to stop Bowe. And he wanted to stop all the critics saying that he wasn't no Mike Tyson, you know. And that's actually why Holyfield became obsessed with Mike Tyson. Because of the fact that the press were giving Tyson all this credit and not giving the credit to Holyfield. Holyfield became utterly obsessed with Tyson. Emanuel Stewart talked about this when he trained Holyfield for the rematch with Riddick Bowe. He said he's never, I remember two things Manny Stewart said about Holyfield. He said he's never seen a fighter as egotistical as Holyfield before, which is interesting. You know, Holyfield was seen as this humble guy, this, that, and the other. That's how he appears on screen. But behind closed doors, Manny Stewart said Holyfield was the most egotistical heavyweight he's ever worked with. He said he was totally obsessed with Mike Tyson. He was training him to fight Riddick Bowe in the rematch. But he says during the whole training camp, all Holyfield was talking about was Tyson. Like day in, day out. He was obsessed with Tyson. And so when Don King made Holyfield versus Tyson, the first fight, Manny Stewart said that he called up Don King and said, you just made a big mistake. And Don King was like, what are you talking about? Holyfield's washed up. He said, no, you don't understand. Holyfield is obsessed with Tyson. This guy's been obsessing about him for years. You know, since the Bowe rematch when I trained him, man, this guy is absolutely obsessed with Tyson. He thinks about nothing other than Mike Tyson and fighting him and how he's going to beat him. So he was studying Tyson for years, and obviously they sparred when they were amateurs. And when they sparred, it was in the camp for the Olympic trials. And Holyfield was a light heavyweight at the time, 175 pounds. Tyson was a heavyweight, might have even been a super heavyweight. No, I think he was a heavyweight. So Tyson was 200 pounds plus. Holyfield was 175, 25 pounds at least lighter than Tyson. And they got in the ring together and sparred. And Holyfield more than held his own, according to the people who were there. Even though he was giving away 25 pounds. Holyfield was a guy in his, you know, even in his amateur days, who was always upset by fighters that got a lot of praise and fighters who were feared. There was a fighter in the amateurs called Ricky Womack, who sadly passed away. I believe he committed suicide, if memory serves me correct. And Ricky Womack was kind of a Mike Tyson. This is certainly how, and I've watched several of his fights. You can see some of them on YouTube. But this is how Manny Stewart described him, as a Mike Tyson type figure in US amateur boxing at the time. He was a bully, he was a street guy. A lot of people were afraid of him. He knocked a lot of people out. And Holyfield developed kind of an obsession with Ricky Womack. He was like, I want to fight this guy. I'm sick of it. people saying this guy's a killer and a beast. I want to fight him. That's the attitude that Holyfield always had. And so he developed that same kind of thing with Mike Tyson. Even from the amateurs, when people were saying Tyson's a killer and telling Holyfield, no, you don't want to spar with this guy. Holyfield's not like, no, I do want to spar this guy. I'll show you this guy's not all that bad. And he got in there and held his own. More than held his own, according to some people. But the coaches there stopped the spar because it was so ferocious. They stopped it and they said, no, you guys have got fights coming up. We can't have you guys beating the crap out of each other and then going into your fights damaged. So they stopped the spar. But even from then, you know, Holyfield's obsession had begun with Tyson. Anyway, people, let me end this video right here because I'm digressing all over the damn place. Let me know how you feel about everything I talked about in this video, all the points I've raised. This heavyweight division of ours, the ingredients are all there for it to get explosive. They just need to be mixed together, those ingredients. I mean, let me have a look at this top 10 again. Imagine Luis Ortiz versus Povetkin. Terrific fight. Ortiz against Joshua. Joshua against Wilder. David Haye against Ortiz. People, there are just tremendous matchups to be made. And hopefully in 2017 we see some of them. So, yeah, I'm going to end the video right here. Drop your comments in the comment section below. Thank you for watching and listening. It's always appreciated. It's your boy Hatman. I'm out.